Last year, I committed myself to the biggest and most ambitious cosplay I have ever attempted. Fearne Callway is my magnum opus, my masterpiece, my chef d'oeuvre, and I'm definitely pronouncing that one wrong. I just googled synonyms for magnum opus. Anyway, since then, I've barely made any progress. I made some legs, I'm probably still going to redo a bunch of stuff on the legs, and that is as far as I've gotten. Almost a year of starting a project and all I've done is the legs feels a little silly. That ends today, my friends. We are getting back into it. Hello, I'm Miss Twisted. You can call me Charlotte. I do cosplay, makeup, and other weird and whimsical stuff. And we are going to make this utterly ridiculous, floaty, multi-layered skirt thing. I'm scared. Let's break this down, shall we? First up, look at how it's sitting. There's all these floaty, billowing layers. We need some sort of supportive underlayer, and for that we're doing panniers, also known as pocket hoops. I want to stick with these because there's only really volume that I need at the sides of the hips. I have never made pocket hoops or a hoop skirt or even a petticoat before, so that's going to be a time. Once that is done, we are getting into the meat and potatoes of this skirt, and for that we have all of these green and yellow, orange floaty layers, and they have to be ultra lightweight to make them, you know, floaty, which instantly makes me think of like a chiffon or organza. And they need to be able to dye extremely well because my old enemy is back to haunt me. Gradient dyeing. And the fact that we have all of these gathers and ruffles and floatiness and layers means I'm going to have to turn to my other old enemy, mock-ups. Once I've done my pocket hoops and worked out my pattern pieces with the mock-up, then I can gradient dye my pieces, and then I need to do those perfect little curly hemlines. That's all going to get sewn into a waistband, and for a sort of finishing touch, I have this little rosette spiral flower thing going on. I know there's all these bits of foliage and whatnot, but I think that's going to be another video. Well, we have that all mapped out, so let's start with the pocket hoops. So I was super intimidated by the idea of this, but looking at some online tutorials, oh my god, they're relatively simple. They're just like a rectangle with some boning in it and another rectangle to hold it together. I don't want to jinx myself, but this part might actually be super easy. So I've got some steel boning. These are pieces that I pulled out of like an old hoop skirt that wasn't what I wanted, so I've just kind of salvaged the part. I've got some nice ribbon. I've got some bias binding. The only reason I've got bias binding is because this is a really stiff bias binding. It might work better as like boning casing than the ribbon is. And I've got a meter or two of this cotton voile. Why banana yellow? Well, Fearne skirts are like green and yellow and orange, and the fabric place I was at didn't have orange and their green was ugly as hell, and I kind of really like this yellow. I mean, you're not going to see any of it anyway under the skirt, so the color is really just for us. Watching a few tutorials has sparked my hubris, so I'm not going to use any patterns for this, just vibes. I'm going to cut out roughly the shapes I need and see how we go. Let's vibe our way to some panniers. So out of my voile, I'm going to cut myself a couple of these little rectangles. I suppose they're actually closer to trapeziums. I'm going to cut myself some longer ones to go on the side and a bunch of little bean shapes for pockets. I don't own an overlocker, so my pockets are all getting French seams. So basically sewn together and then turned inside out and then sewn together again. That way all of those edges are fully encased so they're not going to fray. I'm going to sew that directly into this slit that I've put at the top of this rectangle or trapezium. And as usual guys, if I'm not explaining this well, that's because I also have no idea what I'm doing. I'm going to fold and iron down the bottom edge of this rectangle trapezium thing, and onto this bottom edge I'm going to sew some of that bias binding. Just a nice straight stitch down the top and bottom edge to create like a little tube in the middle where I'm going to be able to thread the boning. And then I'm going to sew in two more of those, so I've got 3 total little pockets for the boning going up the pocket hoops. After that, I sewed that extra long panel onto one side. I tried to reinforce that seam by putting some bias binding on the back. Okay, metal boning piece has been cut exactly to the length of these little tubes, and like a true professional, I'm gonna seal off the edge by wrapping it in masking tape. Threading the boning into the channel, this was very satisfying to see, and you can kind of get an idea of how this is gonna hold that structure already. Now, I think this is definitely not how the instructions would have you do it, but I don't like following instructions, so this is just the way that I did this. I'm holding it together with the boning in it all the way through and then sewing it down the other edge, which was kind of not the best way
way to do things. Because the boning is curved and taut, it kept trying to like spring out. I have a feeling I was supposed to sew the whole thing together and then put the boning in. But you know, we got there in the end. And as you can see, I'm trying to seal up this edge with some more of that bias binding just to try and make everything as sealed in and reinforced as possible. Alright, all 3 hoops are now in here. This is fully sealed up. I'm just gonna sew the top here to a waistband and then chuck just a scrap piece of that bias binding over the top of that raw edge because I forgot to hem the top before I sewed it onto the waistband.
Okay, we have some pocket hoops. They are looking lovely. I'm pretty happy with them so far. They're very light and that's going to be very valuable because anywhere I can reduce weight on this costume is going to be of huge benefit. At some point later, I'm probably going to like put a buckle across here so I won't have big straps like flapping around. Anyway, these are looking lovely and floaty and bouncy, so hopefully with some floaty bouncy skirts over the top, it's going to be a good look overall. And of course, it's got pockets. One big rookie error that I made, I used that really stiff bias binding as casing because I'm like, it's going to be nice and reinforced. But because the casing is on the inside and where the boning is pressing is on the outside where it's just cotton voile, so where it's actually pressing against the voile, there isn't really any reinforcement. So at some point I'm going to have to go over these areas to have something on the outside reinforcing these sections. Otherwise, I'm afraid this is going to rip through the voile at some point. But that is for future Charlotte to worry about. For now, I want to move straight on to the mock-up.
Oh, hi there. No sponsorship today. This is just future me interrupting past me to tell my fellow Aussies that I'm going to be at PAX Australia. I'm going to be there all 3 days. On the Friday, I'm going to be this Zelda. I'm going to be in 2 panels, both of which are very unserious and unhinged. I will put the details up here somewhere for you to read. I'll be there Saturday too as Juniper and Sunday as whatever I have the energy left to wear. But feel free to come and say hi if you see me. I hope to see you there and back to past me.
Let's talk materials and fibers and all that sort of thing. We've got a huge, voluminous, super floaty skirt, which instantly to me says chiffon or organza. Both super, super lightweight floaty fabrics. Organza traditionally is like a little bit stiffer. It holds its shape a bit better, whereas chiffon's more drapey. If I've got that wrong, sewing people can actually me in the comments. Anyway, because these are also going to be gradient dyed to get that transition between yellow and orange, that is going to be way easier to achieve with natural fiber. The only problem is the only natural fiber you can really do for chiffon or organza is silk, which is famously very expensive. Pricey enough that I would go with synthetic and just deal with the fact that the dyeing process is gonna suck a little more. But this stuff is pure silk organza. And I know you're thinking this must have cost an arm and a leg, but listen, this was $4 a meter. My sewing girlies out there already know what's up, but for everyone else, just understand that that price for silk is preposterous. It is unheard of. Now, I got this stuff from a place called Silk and Stitch. They do dead stock fabric, which is essentially fabric no longer needed for a big company. Essentially the leftovers. To clarify, you probably wouldn't find that price if you went there right now. I just got extremely lucky that they had exactly what I was after, and they were having a massive Black Friday sale, which combined with my wholesale discount. So hear me out here. I'm not really going to make a mock-up, and I'm not just saying that because I want a chance to get out of making a mock-up, I promise. Because the skirt is essentially just like a buttload of gathers and ruffles and swags of fabric, I can just kind of drape my existing silk on the mannequin and pin it in place to determine the shape that I want without cutting into my expensive silk.
Quick side note, this is chiffon, not organza. I only discovered that later in the process of making this though.
So all I've done at this stage is very roughly pin it to the mannequin over the pocket hoops, just so I can get an idea of how things are like draping, how they're hanging, and this is looking pretty promising. I love the slight shine. I was a little bit worried the organza would be too see-through and show the yellow of the pocket hoops. I think once it's gathered up, it doesn't seem to be a problem. I think just due to the nature of the skirt and the fabrics I'm using, I'm not going to know exactly how it's going to sit until it's cut and dyed and hemmed, but this is enough for me to see that it is going to work and how much fabric I'm going to need to dye.
To give you guys an idea of exactly how much silk I'm working with, I had 10 meters of that light light green silk that was essentially in 2 pieces. For this off-white, I think I ended up with around 15 meters total.
So this gives me an idea of how much fabric I need for each of these pieces. If I have like 2 of these hip swags, 2 of these like second layers here, and then 2 of these that go all the way around and will join at the front.
All right, time to dye this fabric. Now my light green is not far off the bottom of this skirt, but I'm gonna freshen it up with a tiny bit of teal and a green,
just to brighten up that color a tad. So I've got the dye with some water and some vinegar heating up on my stovetop, and with a little piece that is already wet so that the dye sits nice and evenly, I'm just gonna start lowering this in and pulling it out of the dye gradually. Rinse and dry my test piece and then just wait and see.
All right, initially I wasn't sure if I wanted to gradient dye the green layer or just do it all the same flat color, because looking at the concept art, there is like a little bit of a gradient, but that also could just be like how they've represented shadow. But even if it is just representing shadow, it's gonna look really cool if it's gradient dyed. Anyway, my test piece came out beautifully. Like this dyed almost instantly, which is fantastic. Like that is exactly what I want. I think I am gonna keep the very bottom edge in this like light green that's almost white. And if I decide once the whole thing is dyed that I don't like it, I can always do the hem slightly higher up into the gradient section. Okay, big challenge with gradient dyeing is you kind of have to hold your fabric piece flat-ish so that you can dip in and out easily without getting like crunchy lines or folds in the fabric while it's dyeing. Very easy to do with a small test piece like this, but with giant rectangular pieces like my skirt is going to be, that is really hard. I think I've come up with a solution. It looks kind of silly, but like hear me out on this. So this is a bunch of like the spare steel boning that I used for my pocket hoops that I've like basically taped into a giant hoop and just pegged my fabric onto. And my idea is that it's essentially going to provide like a bit of a like a frame so that I can dip this in and out of some sort of like giant bucket for my gradient dyeing. Oh my god, this is so stupid looking, but like I have tried this once before for my Aravos cosplay like ages ago, and it kind of worked. So I think it's either this or cut it into like a bunch of individual triangles and end up doing like 8 to 16 different seams to sew it all back together again. I'll be able to get the most even gradient dyeing that I can. And at the very least, this green layer can serve as a practice round before I do the much more important, much more visible yellow to orange gradient dye. The only problem is with a hoop that size, I can't do this inside and I can't do it using a tiny little stovetop. Luckily, these test layers went into this deeper green almost instantaneously. So I think what I can do is heat up most of my water on the stove nice and hot before I put it in some sort of like larger shallow bucket outside and just very quickly start to do the dipping. So it's a very roundabout way to do things, but if I can pull it off, I think it'll give me the best results. I am going to need some sort of like giant shallowish bucket to dip it in though. So I'm going to go to Bunnings and I'll see you guys in a bit. Okay, success. I have a giant plastic shallowish tub which I should be able to use for my dip dyeing. The only thing is, of course, it is going to be like 5 times the volume as my little tiny stovetop. Now I bought like 5 little things of that dye, so it should just about be enough as long as I keep this relatively shallow.
So heating up all the concentrated dye in my designated dye pot while my safe for cooking stock pots boil up a bunch of water on top. All of that super hot water is going in this giant bucket outside, and now time is of the essence because I'm racing against it before all of this cools down too much to really affect the dyeing process. While still balancing moving as fast as possible but also not spilling dye or hot water anywhere, I've got a big bucket here of just plain water just to dip my fabric in, make sure it's wet through. Having your fabric soaked beforehand really helps everything stay even, and when you're dyeing outside like I am, it also means it's not going to blow away in the wind. Beginning the nerve-wracking part of actually dipping this piece of fabric, I was a little bit panicked about the fact that the fabric kept sticking together despite the hoop, but the folds at this point didn't really affect it too much, and having it on the hoop did ensure that like no matter what, the top of the fabric stayed at the same level, so the gradient was forming along like parallel to where the hem was going to be. I'm going right around the outside of my house to give this a rinse off in the laundry. I don't want to lose my bond dripping dye onto any of the carpet.
All right, all of my green pieces are now fully dry, and look at these. Are they not looking absolutely fabulous. Like, look at this color transition is just beautiful. I've managed to get through this one with very little like streaking or unevenness. The gradient is all pretty nice. I think it definitely helps that it's like a subtle gradient, like it's from green to green. So moving on, the rest of my silk needs to have like a base layer of butter yellow. In terms of finding the dye for this one, I got really lucky a few months ago at Spotlight. The little packets of powdered dye were down to $1 each for the lemon yellow. For the record, these are usually $10 each.
All right, time for a test drive. So I let one piece of my scrap silk just sort of hang out in the dye. The other one I started to dip dye.
So, couple of test pieces. This is one that I've kind of done a bit of a gradient dye just so I can see the different levels of yellow I can get. This one down the bottom here is like leaving it in for a while, and I think that's too much yellow going on. I think I want my pieces to be around here.
Luckily for me, none of the yellow pieces actually have to be in a gradient, so everything can just get scrunched into my pot on the stove. No going outside for this one. I just had to make sure I ducked it in, swirled it around, and took it out before it got too bright of yellow. This was like at 11 p.m, so I had to hang this out outside in the dark, and we have no lights in our backyard, so please enjoy this footage straight out of a horror film.
So my yellow pieces are looking absolutely beautiful. I don't know how else to describe this color besides delicious. It makes me think of like lemon cream, like cupcakes. For round 3, with the orange, I've got a couple of different dyes to use. This is going to be the main one I want to use, which is a coral. And I really like this one because it's got those sort of peachy pinky undertones. It's not just like a straight up orange. And I think that kind of matches the concept art pretty well. But I've got some of the powdered tangerine dye as well, just to bump up the orange a little bit. So, test piece turned out pretty well. It looks actually a perfect color in camera. In person, this is actually quite a bit more pink, but then I found this slightly too orange and not enough of those peach tones. And I know that like nobody's gonna sit there and be like, oh, your skirt is too orange. Actually, someone will. There's always someone in the comments just dying to actually me about my cosplays. Anyway, third test run, add a tiny bit more coral, but watered the whole thing down so it wasn't too strong, is this one. And again, in camera, that looks like nothing, but it is right between these two, I promise. So this is the sweet spot I'm aiming for, and I just have to remember my exact ratios when I do the giant pot.
At the very least, I've got 4 rectangles that are going to form those hip swags that only have to be this peachy orange tone. All right, round 2 gradient dye back in my carport. It was a really windy day, which was the worst for gradient dyeing because I couldn't hold it straight down. And patience is not my strong point, so there was no way I was gonna wait for like a non-windy day for this. I gotta say, I didn't expect gradient dyeing silk to get my adrenaline pumping so much.
All right, I think I've been dyeing fabric now for like 2.5 days straight. Worth it though. This is an example of one of my orange to yellow pieces, and I have a lovely soft gradient there. I'm really happy with that. Oh, fun story. I lit my countertop on fire during this process. So this was while I was doing the smaller pieces for the corset. So I was doing it inside on my stovetop. And a little splash of the dye landed on the countertop next to the stove. One thing I've learned gets dye out of countertops really well is like nail polish remover, right? And you can see where this is going now. So tiny bit of nail polish remover onto the countertop to try and wipe up that to make sure it doesn't stain the countertop with dye. And apparently it was like just close enough to the live flame on the gas stove that and suddenly my countertop was on fire. Luckily for me, the only visible sign is like a slight discoloration, and it was on fire for like maybe 3 seconds while my brain just short-circuited, and then it was gone. So it wasn't like the end of the world. It was just a moment of like, oh, that wasn't very smart. Okay, so with all my dyeing done, the mannequin's back out because I'm gonna have to like pin and cut my fabric and sew my pieces together. So I'm just gonna start draping it and pinning it in place, and I think I'm just gonna wing it because it's just the best way that I know how to do these things, honestly. All right, I'm gonna need to start cutting off the excess at the top of this one, and this is where things are gonna get a little nerve-wracking.
Now the front of this skirt is going to be quite short to show those fawn legs, but then I'm also cutting off some of the excess, which means that some of the gradient dye isn't going to be perfectly even. I'm kind of okay with this on the green layer just because there's so much movement. It feels a little bit more organic to me anyway, to have some of that color variation showing through under those orange layers.
So I've got something kind of funky planned for the hems, which I haven't tried before, so this is going to be a first for me. This stuff here is called band roll. I think it's also called herringbone tape, but but it's essentially like a tightly woven tape that's very, very stiff. It's kind of almost like horsehair braid. I came across this while like looking for different ways of doing like really tiny hems on things like organzas and chiffon to try and make them neat, because I've always struggled with that stuff. Apparently with this stuff, the idea is you kind of like cut off just the very top part of this. So I should be able to like pull out some of these threads.
With 4 or 5 of these strands pulled away, it leaves this little comb of like little tiny bits of plastic all on one end.
Okay, I've got a nice long strip of the band roll where I've pulled away the threads, and I've got a little practice piece of the silk.
So we're figuring this one out together, guys. We have that little comb section facing towards the edge of my fabric. I'm using the selvage to help me line this up and putting my needle down to make sure it's hitting where those little combs start and not on the ribbon part. And we are just going to sew along a lovely little straight stitch. Because the band roll tape is so stiff already, it helps stabilize the chiffon below and keeps everything in a straight line. Now that straight stitch is going to hold that band roll tape to the fabric just for now, and we're going to cut off all the excess beyond those little combs. Alright, now comes the fun part. We are going to turn this band roll tape around twice, and that is essentially going to create like this fold in this fabric and hold it exactly where we need it to get a lovely straight line out of this hem. And then once again, we are going to sew down a straight stitch the same way as you would with any old rolled hem, but because we've got that band roll in place, it's holding the fabric exactly where you need it to make sure you're not stretching or puckering, and it's going to create like a nice straight line. And here's the magic. When you pull this out, because you've got those exposed little comb parts, this isn't actually gripping onto anything, so you can slowly pull the fabric away from this band roll tape now. I was being very careful and awkward at the start here, but you can essentially just pull this straight out with confidence. And keep in mind, this is only my first try of this one, but even so, I have this tiny hem that is lovely and straight.
I will do a couple more practice rounds before I do the actual skirt, but that definitely works. The aim there is to get that enclosed edge on basically as small a hem as possible and still have it neat, and I think it achieves that.
So with a few test pieces under my belt, we are trying this on my actual piece. I am also threading a little piece of fishing line here into that rolled hem. Adding fishing lines to hems like this can just make them a little bit floaty, so we're gonna see how that looks. It did make this a lot more awkward because I had to keep pushing it back in to make sure it was in the stitch line. On that note, I am seriously underplaying exactly how frustrating this whole process was. And let's not forget, I had around 8 to 10 meters to hem. After all the wrangling of the fishing line, I pulled it out because it was kind of giving jellyfish vibes. Cool effect, but not the vibes I wanted. From about 2 meters of that green fabric, I've cut that off the main part of the skirt, and I'm cutting out some smaller rectangles to turn into sleeves. Very important break from my sewing projects to show you this little guy who was hanging out outside my window at the time, literally like half a meter away from my window. And now I feel totally justified procrastinating mowing my lawn. Back to my sleeve pieces, so I've cut out 8 of these shapes. Basically, I'm going to make 2 trumpet sleeves for each arm to sort of layer up both of them, just to make them extra full. As per usual, this is no patterns, just vibes. Now, I was pretty enamored with this band roll thing. I wanted to try and see if I could use it for seams as well as hems. So I've got my 2 pieces of the sleeve together that I'm sewing as I usually would with the band roll. But because this is 2 pieces of fabric, when it comes to turning that band roll around, I'm still turning it around the same way, but my 2 pieces of fabric are folded open. I think this is the equivalent of a flat felled seam. Sewing people, actually me in the comments if I'm wrong about this. Aside from opening the fabric, I'm sewing this down exactly the same way, except I'm doing 2 straight stitches, 1 on each edge of that folded seam. I hope that makes sense. Because both of these top stitches on the band roll are being stitched on that comb section and not the woven ribbon section, you can still pull the band roll out the same way as you would with the hem. And you guys, this is the neatest seam I have ever done. Now, I'm sorry for skipping over some of this, but we're going to come back to the sleeves a little bit later. For now, it's back to the skirt.
So, all of my green parts of this skirt have now been hemmed. Right now, it's just pinned to the mannequin. Firstly, on a positive note, this whole band roll technique is a game changer. Like, oh my god. Okay, I did also look up my receipt from like a year ago, and it turns out this is chiffon. It's not organza. I don't know where I got that idea from. Anyway, chiffon, famously one of the worst fabrics to sew with in the history of the universe. Just really finicky. And then this is an ultra fine, delicate silk chiffon, and yet these are like some of the neatest seams I have ever done in my entire life. On a less positive note, silk chiffon is the absolute devil's work. This stuff, I swear to God, you look at it at the slightly wrong angle and it will tear, it will pucker, it will just destroy itself. And part of the reason why over the last day or so of me sewing, I haven't really like shown my face in a lot of the footage is because I was like dancing on the edge of a little mentee bee, as the kids say. Because even with something as cool as the band roll technique, which I'm going to be using forever, this stuff was just such a pain to work with. It almost broke me. It really did. What I have learned is you have to be so patient and so delicate, and then just pray to the cosplay gods and anything else that's listening for everything to go right. So remember how I had for my yellow and orange gradient pieces 6 really big rectangles of fabric that I dyed? Well, basically what I've done so far is sew all 6 of those together into basically just like one really long, very long rectangle. And I think this is around 10 meters or so worth of like rectangle. It's basically just one giant rectangle. Now, the one good thing about this particular layer is that unlike this one, which has got like this weird up and down hemline, this is basically just gonna be one big rectangle. There's not really much extra shaping I need to worry about. The bad news is this does mean I have a 10-meter long singular hem to do on this whole piece.
Luckily, I ordered a ton of band roll. I'm gonna try and make a 10-meter long strip of this tape because I want to make sure my giant seam is as neat as possible. I've gone for a slightly thicker fishing line this time, which does make it easier because I can actually feel it within the seam in order to push it onto the edge, making sure it's enclosed within the stitches.
So I'm at the point where like, I feel like I've been sewing for like an hour or two. I don't know exactly, but I got really discouraged looking at how much I still have to go of this damn giant piece of freaking silk. Oh, I just want it to be done.
Patience is not my strong point, and that took forever, but we're finally at the fun part, so I get to take the actual tape off. That's looking pretty promising, honestly. I think with like a good press under an iron, just to straighten these out a little bit. How's that hanging is the next question. Okay, this is what I wanted to see. I think that fishing line in there is wonderful because it's not giving jellyfish, but it is just giving that hem, that slight floatiness that I was really after, which is wonderful. I hope it looks this good once I've got it up on a mannequin.
For the front edge of these skirt pieces, I had this great idea to use a strip of horsehair braid, essentially the same way where I'm going to flip it over a few times to enclose that edge. The idea being that the horsehair braid will provide a lot of lovely stability and create like a nice straight line at the front. Honestly, even in hindsight, a great idea in theory. In practice, however, okay, I've like re-sewn and then cut off and then re-sewn a few times now, both of these edges, and no matter like how carefully I pin it down to make sure it's sitting straight, I always end up with like it going curly-whirly like this. And man, that's the problem with chiffon, right? Is it's like, it's so slippery. It's like trying to sew jelly. So trying to get like force a really straight piece of horsehair braid onto this really slippery fabric, it's just not having it. So I actually think I'm going to ditch the horsehair braid idea and just go for a standard band roll hem down the front and just deal with it, because I just don't think this is working out for me.
Much like with the green layer, I'm just loosely pinning this onto the mannequin just to make sure that I'm happy with how everything's sitting.
All right, so like obviously exact placement I'll worry about once I'm sewing it onto some sort of waistband, but in general, I'm honestly really relieved to get to this point because I was feeling real bad before because this was just being such a pain to sew with, and once I realized that this was chiffon and not organza, I was thinking like, damn, I should have used organza. What am I doing? I've wasted all this money, I've wasted all this time. But like seeing it on here, I think this was actually the right choice. Organza would have been very easy to give everything like a really big body, but it's very crisp. I wouldn't have had like these lovely soft drapey vibes, which I think just works so well for Fearne. I think before I put this all onto a waistband, I'm going to tackle the sleeves. I've done like a little bit of work on them already, but I think I want to finish those off like while I'm still relatively practiced with the chiffon. And also because I think if I put it down and then come back to the chiffon, I'm gonna want to not do it.
Just like before, I have cut out 8 total little trumpet sleeve pieces out of my orange and yellow fabric, doing some more of my little band roll seams. I've sewn the whole seam along the top here, but this seam, it didn't go well. It did not go well. Like, I've got this weird little lumpy bit here, and I thought it was the thread tension. And so I was like changing it back and forth, and it seemed to do nothing. Like, these stitches were so loose. And it was, oh my god, it was driving me crazy because I'm like, I had the thread tension all the way up to the top and all the way down, and the threads look the same. And then it turned out that it was the bobbin had come like, you know, like how it goes like this and then comes out. It had come unhooked from there, so it was just coming straight out, which is why the whole thing was so loose. Oh my god, and it took me so long to realize it. So these parts, I'm not going to redo these ones because some of these, like, you can see that the threads are like a little bit loose, but only if you're staring at them like this close. I don't want to like lose too much actual length, but I think I'm gonna like just cut this seam and redo that seam because it looks so bad. And I'm so annoyed because I was sewing for so long without realizing what the issue was. Oh, I hate chiffon so much. Actually, I can't blame that on chiffon. That is entirely me not knowing how to troubleshoot because again, like, no one's ever taught me to sew. I just picked up a sewing machine and started experimenting. So sometimes you've just got to muck around until something works, and I at least have figured out what the issue was. But if I redo that seam, I'm cutting this so short. Like, I have not made these sleeves long enough. I don't have any more fabric. That's it for the gradient dyed. Oh my god. Kind of want to cry. I'm not going to go buy more silk and gradient dye the whole piece again and then sew it together all over again just to get a couple of extra inches of the... I'm just going to have to deal with it. Oh, I want to burn this whole thing.
Okay, so it's been a few hours. I'm not gonna lie, I had a little bit of a cry. I know that seems kind of silly to cry over seams, and it is very silly. I'm not sorry. I get very emotionally invested in my cosplays, and look, if I'm honest, like I said before about the skirt, I was so frustrated, and I think this frustration has been building up during this project, and I think also I'm putting a lot of subconscious pressure on myself because I want to enter this in competition, so I'm trying to make it as perfect as possible. But I need to be realistic about my expectations because I'm working with silk chiffon, which is a famously hard fabric to work with, and I've never worked with it before. I think classified as a beginner when it comes to sewing because I have no formal training. I'm working on essentially a beginner's machine, doing techniques that I've never done before in my life. It's just unrealistic and unhealthy that I was even subconsciously expecting everything to go perfectly. I think compounding that is the fact that I want to enter this into competitions eventually, and I have this like image in my head of the judges ignoring every other part of my cosplay and all the ingenuity and multiple techniques to just stare at the seams with like a ruler to measure and be like, oh, there's no points for you, these seams aren't perfect. So anyway, I've had a bit of a break for a few hours. I had some snacks, I've got my tea now, I went on a stupid walk for my stupid mental health, and I'm feeling a little bit more well-rounded. I'm kind of glad that I got that emotion out though. I think it had been building up for a little while. Also, I ran the iron over the seams and it definitely looks a lot better now, and honestly, like, nobody's gonna be looking at it that close. So I'm gonna finish off my tea, maybe do some gaming for a little bit, and then I'm just gonna smash out the rest of these little sleeve pieces.
Okay, I've got now 2 yellow pieces and I want to attach them together relatively close to the top just to make sure that they stay relatively even. And my thoughts are to take these 2 seams and essentially line them up and then sew from about like here down the seam, so that essentially I'm disguising any extra seams that stitches them together in an existing stitch line anyway. So now I have 2 doubled up sleeves for each arm, one of them with a double layer of orange and one of them with a double layer of green. I'm going to shove the green layer into the orange and yellow layer and just sort of try and line it up so that those ends are roughly at the same point. To make up for the fact that these sleeves are slightly shorter than I expected, I'm just sort of sewing them together at roughly where the elbow elbow would be.
Okay, in every project that I do, there's always like a second win moment where I feel motivated again. And I think this is it for me because the sleeves look pretty fantastic, honestly. So the main thing I wanted to do was try and get all of this fullness in here because in the concept art, they defy gravity, right? Her hands are like this and yet there's all these ruffles going on here. How does that work? Anyway, what I've done to try and get some of that happening is I've made these green sections slightly wider than the yellow section so that it kind of is forced to bunch up a little bit in here to kind of create some extra ruffle. So that's how that works. Looks really lovely from this angle here. Does look a little bit awkward here, like I could have made this all one piece. It was just easier making a separate tube. But remember that this area here is going to be covered up with the purple scarf. So you're not actually going to see this middle section. It just really has to be there to hold everything else in place. So with the sleeves done, I'm actually going to make that little spiral piece before I start to sew the rest of the skirt together, just because I kind of just need a break from that.
Knowing full well this was going out of the frying pan and into the fire, I just started experimenting with different curved and spiral shapes out of paper to try and create like a paper pattern version of this that I was happy with before I cut into any expensive fabric. And this whole thing was just trial and error, trying different shapes, seeing how much curve, how much spiral I needed to give each piece, what kind of size I needed for each piece, with the help of some hot glue to just hold it in place until I was happy with the shape. This took an entire afternoon, well into the night. I'm not sure if that's a good or bad thing. I've never made a shape like this before, but it was just slowly building up until I was happy with the rough shape.
Okay, good morning. I stayed up past midnight making this, and honestly, it looks kind of cool. I wanted to make basically like a paper pattern of that little zigzag pleated absolute monstrosity on her skirt. And I think this is pretty much nailing the shape. Like I've tried to map every single little curve and shape on it. Why did they draw it like that? All right, thinking about how I'm going to try and get my chiffon into that shape. First things that come to mind are like pleating boards and starching the heck out of it. I did a little practice run of this, which is literally just some scrap chiffon offcut that I covered in a little bit of Mod Podge. As you can see, it does kind of ruin the texture of the chiffon and makes it look like it's permanently wet even when it's dry. So I don't think that option is going to work, although it does hold its shape really nicely. So I have a couple of different kinds of starch products and fabric stiffeners that are going to come in the mail, but all of them I had to order overseas. I couldn't find any here in Australia. So I'm going to set the little decorative spiral piece aside for now and just treat it as like a natural stopping point, and that just might be like in a future video or something. So thinking about how to attach them, I want it to be something that can like wrap around me and clasp together somehow at the front like a belt, but I do want it to be relatively low profile because it's going to be under corsets and sturdy enough not to come undone. So I brought some bras because I'm actually going to nick the little bra hooks off the back of these because of course bras are designed to be low profile under clothing and they're not going to come undone. Usually this is the kind of thing I would go to an op shop for, that's thrift stores to my Americans, but like the cheapest bra I could find was $12. These are Kmart bras. The most expensive one was $4. I try not to do fast fashion, but I can't justify spending $12 a bra just to nick the bra hooks off the back. Anyway, we're gonna nick the hooks off this one, and a lot of the extra cups and straps I'll keep for something. I always end up finding weird use for things.
So these hook sections are just getting sewn directly onto a piece of elastic roughly the same width, and that is all there is to it to attach this one. I have no idea why we don't use this method to attach tons of different waistbands and skirts. I've now got 3 of these little waistbands ready to rumble, and I'm hoping eventually I can stagger where they sit against my skin under the corset so I won't have any big visible lines showing through. Now I'd love to show you how I sewed the green skirt onto the first waistband, but I lost all of that footage. So sorry, that part is getting skipped.
Okay, we have a second layer of skirt now fully waistbanded, I guess. So that second layer of elastic just helps kind of like seal in that raw edge, and it does have like an elastic stitch so that there is still some stretch there. So what I've done at the back here is, for starters, I've done like a nice band roll hem on this exposed edge, and right in the middle of that I've put on one of these hooks just with some hand stitching, which means essentially when these little bra hook things are hooked together, I can can use this little hook here and chuck it onto one of these, just to basically pull up all of that leftover fabric that like creates the slack at the back. That way it holds up this fabric and stops there being like any uneven hem right at the bottom here. And these little loopy bits are just gonna tuck into the corset anyway, so yeah. So you guys, I like to think of myself as like, you know, a bit of a smart lady. I've got a bit of a brain going on. I'm pretty good at problem solving sometimes. Sometimes I do some really stupid things that have a very obvious solution. Like I've gone to all this effort of having this little hook thing here for all this loose stuff, and gone to all this effort of having like an open waistband that can go around rather than me pulling up. And then I've like sewn one solid circle piece around here. And realistically, the obvious thing is to split this whole thing down the back so that I can literally put it around without pulling it up over my head or like underneath. I don't know why that didn't occur to me, and I just went ahead and did this thing, which is like not a bad idea, but it's just so unnecessary. I think splitting the skirt down the middle at the back here is an excellent idea for future Charlotte to worry about. I think I don't want to touch this layer for now. I just want to get the whole skirt together and functioning, and then future Charlotte can worry about those other bits.
Another round pinning the fabric to the waistband, and you can see this peachy tone is a lot softer because I gave all of my orange pieces a really hot wash to soften that color a little bit. I've basically laid this all out on the floor now that I've got like one side cut to what height I need it, so that essentially I can cut off all the excess in a straight line, so no matter what, it's the right height for me to sew onto the waistband and it's all an even height.
Okay, with my giant 10-meter long rectangle of fabric,
Now all at the same height, I'm repinning this one to my waistband, and I did actually find it was easier to sew together some of these gathers. I've also concentrated the gathered fabric at the front and sides of this one and less so at the back.
So the skirt is like 90% done, and it's just kind of looming over my shoulder back there in the background. I'm gonna leave it before I attach the hip swags as like the last section, just because like I can tell I'm getting so frustrated with this thing. I never want to touch chiffon again. I can tell you that much. To give myself a bit of a break mentally, I've been working on that little fractal spiral piece.
Now, I had fully expected to leave this spiral piece for another video, but I remembered I had this piece of silk taffeta that I'd bought for the corset, and it was just like a sample piece, but it was just not the right thickness, but perfect for this. So I've got some ultra hold heat and bond ironed onto one side. It's like a double-sided adhesive. On the other, I'm ironing down some white organza. This combination of materials means that it's going to be stiff enough to hold its shape, thin enough that it's going to hold some nice crisp folds, and the heat and bond basically seals the fibers in the silk so that you don't have to worry about fraying on the edges. So I had to deconstruct my paper pattern piece with some scissors so that I could use these individual shapes as my pattern pieces on my silk heat and bond amalgamation. This exact combination of materials also ended up with a consistency not far off paper, so I was able to sort of manually fold these to quite a great degree. I did run an iron over it with very low heat but high pressure. It reactivated the heat and bond just a little, which basically means that it's going to kind of hold these folds really well. Given I only had a very small piece of silk for this project, I had to use some smaller pieces and like glue them together to create that larger pattern. For a nice sturdy base, I've also got some scrap dupioni, which I have heat and bonded to itself, basically so I've got like a nice sturdy circle piece that I can attach all of the spiral pieces to hold its shape. I used a combination of fabric glue and stitching it to the base here, which was harder than I thought. I think just because my needle here is going through several different layers of silk and the heat and bond, it just became a bit of a pain in the butt, but we got there in the end.
So far, this is working absolutely beautifully. I really love the fact that it's like just the slightest bit translucent, which kind of makes it feel like it's going to be somewhere between the like floaty sheerness of the silk chiffon and like the crispness of the silk dupion that's going to be on the corset layer later.
After wrestling with some fabric glue for a while, I did find that hot glue was just a far better solution to get these in place nice and quickly and give it a bit more dimension. All of the hot glue areas are going to be well embedded within this shape, so you're not going to see any lumpy bits or hot glue strings.
Okay, this looks fantastic. I'm so happy with how this turned out. That was such a pain to get right though. That was also nerve-wracking because like in terms of what I've got left of that silk, I have this and like these two pieces that didn't work. And apart from that, I would have had to have bought some more and wait months because this stuff came from overseas. But we're not done yet because I have to paint this now. So I'm gonna airbrush this, and I've got a couple little pieces here left over that I can use as testers, because if I stuff this up, I'm gonna cry about it because there's not much I can do if I stuff it up. So I'm just gonna hope for the best.
Now, I'm no expert with the airbrush. I think I am slowly getting better. That said, if you think I'm doing any of this wrong, please feel free to tell me. I'm constantly looking to try and improve this aspect. In any case, I had this lovely bright orange layer to start with. For the purple layer, I did go for a much more opaque airbrush paint that I mixed with a little bit of a blue, just because I didn't want it to sort of clash against the yellow. Even with this bright opaque layer, it still dried relatively dark. Same with the orange, so I went back over the orange with a heavier, more opaque paint, and back over the purple with a little tiny bit of an iridescent paint mixed in just to give it an extra bit of shine, and then added in a bit of a fluoro orange to highlight the ends. And then went back in to paint some very, very fine lines of a much lighter bluey purple on the top here, just to try and highlight and define those zigzags. And I like this effect so much, I did the same thing with a very, very light yellow right on the corners at the ends here. And then because I couldn't leave well enough alone, I even added in a few streaks of the orange too. This was seconds before I spotted that giant splash of orange paint down on the right. I had a good 10 seconds of panic there before I realized I could just kind of go over it with some of that purple.
Good morning, everyone. So I was up till like midnight midnight last night, but look at that. Oh, is that not absolutely freaking gorgeous? And like all of those highlights that I did, those little tiny streaks on like the ends, just help really sell the zigzaggy pleating. Oh, the colors in this. I'm so pleased with this. Damn. I showed a friend of mine the concept art for Fearne, and she said of this area that it looks like an AI has tried to draw a spiral, and I can totally see it. And so the fact that like this shape that looks so weird and impossible that I've managed to do this to, I'm just incredibly chuffed, guys. And this was a really hard project, like all over, so this feels like a moment of triumph at the end of the day. And that has given me, never mind second wind, we're going for third wind because we have one last thing today to do. And God, I hope it's done today because I don't think I can deal with any more of this project. We need to do the hip swags and then the skirt is done. Let's do it.
So these are 4 pieces of silk that I've cut into basically a trapezium shape so that they are slightly longer on one edge than the other, gathering up one end, and I'm just going to wrap that in masking tape just so I can hold it together while I pin it in place. And because of that trapezium shape, one edge is going to hang a lot lower than the other in this beautiful fold.
Okay, so just want to double check that shape one more time so I can kind of see how everything's going to sit. Obviously, like this isn't going to be here, it's going to be attached to some sort of band. That's kind of what it looks like at the back, and I kind of like this crisscrossy, ignore this, but I kind of like that crisscrossy vibe going on at the back here. It gives something interesting. I can do whatever the heck I like with the back because the concept art doesn't show it. So, you know, there's one advantage to doing a cosplay of a thing that you only have one picture for.
In the final stage of this project, my resting bitch face was out in full force while I stitched together some of these gathers.
Oh, fuck. I did the thing where I forgot I was wearing makeup and rubbed my eye. This is fine.
After I finished gathering up these ends here, I still ran it through the sewing machine just with the zigzag stitch very carefully because there's a lot of fabric layers in here. But this is a pretty reinforced edge now. Those gathers are staying put.
Well, that's another broken needle. Didn't think I'd have so many broken needles on a project that involved mostly silk chiffon, but I guess I'm just gathering it too much.
The rest of my gathers were sewn together even more carefully after that, pinning these gathers back onto the waistband and once again very carefully sewing them on. No more broken needles this time. I did the exact same with the second round of hip swags just to lay them up for extra fullness.
Okay, this skirt is, well, it's basically done. Everything is like sewn in place. Everything's sitting nicely. I just need to like hand stitch this onto here and then take it off the mannequin and give it a try.
It needs a bit of pressing, a bit of starching, and we're ready to try this on.
So, bit of a time skip forward because I wanted some time to just go touch grass, leave this project for a little bit, come back to it for any finishing touches. I touched all of the grass and discovered the 2 two most amazing words. Spray on starch. That was 3 words. I meant to say spray starch. Anyway, this stuff. So I got this originally for that little spiral piece, but it didn't arrive until like a week ago, long after this was done. And I kind of thought spray starch was gonna act in a similar way to like Mod Podge and glue, like soaking into everything. But I did a little test on some of my scrap silk chiffon and my life was changed forever. Holy heck, you guys, I've never used starch before. I had no idea what it did, but like a light spritz on all of my edges and a good iron, and I have now some of like the tastiest, crispiest, floatiest edges I have ever seen without losing all of that beautiful swishy motion of the silk chiffon. I think it's about time we tried it all on, don't you?
Taking this cosplay from the mannequin onto my body made all the difference in the world to me, because so much about what makes this skirt impressive is all of that beautiful, floaty, swishy movement. I could finally envision what this is going to look like when it's all done. For a makeshift bodice, I just tied a bunch of my scrap silk around a corset. And then it was just a case of moving around in it, seeing how everything felt. Everything about this is so light and floaty. I can't believe essentially like 20 to 30 meters worth of silk feels like absolutely nothing on me. And we had to get a bit of backyard frolicking just so I could really get a feel for the movement of this piece. In only the most graceful of moves, of course. Did have a Marilyn Monroe moment a couple of times just as the wind was picking up, but it did make for a couple of good photos in the end.
Listen, you guys, this cosplay broke me in several places in my brain, but it was so worth it. Seeing it actually on me for the first time made me realize I've truly begun this monumental challenge, nay, this odyssey of a cosplay. I'm not being dramatic, you're being dramatic. Anyway, despite the blood, sweat, and tears that have already been sacrificed to the cosplay gods, I am immensely happy with how this is looking, and I cannot wait to start on the rest of this cosplay. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you got some amusement out of my pain. A huge shout out to my amazing and insanely patient ultimate supporters on Patreon. Artemis, Brian, Dakota, Fluky, Mix Ranvi, Rakishan, Residual Images, Robert Mischief, Tamara, Veralyn, and Yuri. And thank you as well to all of these other amazing Patreon supporters. Hey, you should come and join us over on Patreon. I post previews, work in progress, and some other mini videos and stuff that you can't find anywhere else. And joining there is the best way to support me so I can keep making the most ambitious and ridiculous projects. The link to my Patreon is in the description below. That is it for today, my dears. I hope to see some of you at PAX, and I can't wait to see you all in the next video. Bye!